You're listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda, hosted by two teachers who break down a different propaganda song each episode. Today we're talking about Ska Sucks, track 5 from the first full-length LP, How to Clean Everything. So, Keith, the first thing I did to prepare for this is I went on YouTube to try to find live footage of the band playing this song. Because I wasn't sure I'd be able to. But a video from 1996 popped up with John K. Sampson on bass. And something that really surprised me is that the crowd, they're in the middle of between two songs, right? And the crowd is yelling, "Ska Sucks! Play Ska Sucks!" And I'm like watching it like, why are you yelling that? And I know they're going to play it because the video, obviously, that I've found on YouTube is them about to play Ska Sucks. But
yeah,
why the audience is yelling for this it just boggles my mind. However,
it's the snowboard frat guy version of Play Some Slayer.
Yeah, yep, Raining Blood. So, but it's 1996 in the video. And so Sampson in the video says, so I'm like, I'm watching it. I'm like, no, not Ska Sucks. And John K. Sampson on the video does exactly what I'm thinking. He goes, no. But Chris Hanna offers to do it, undercutting John. And he says, we'll play it if somebody else sings it. So this dude comes up to sing it. And there's like 4 or 5 people on the stage. And they all want to like all sing it together, like with like multiple voices and heads around the microphone. And this one guy totally monopolizes the microphone and sings like basically the entire thing. And it turns out that guy who monopolized the microphone went on to sing in a ska punk band called the Impossibles from Texas, who were on Fueled by Ramen Records. And so apparently Gabe from the Impossibles sings Ska Sucks on this obscure propaganda video from 1996. So anyway, they played the song. Gabe from the Impossible sings the whole song. A ton of people come on stage, and at the end of the video, one guy is naked on the stage.
That sounds appropriate in some way, yeah.
Yeah, and that's mid-90s for you. So anyway, Keith, how do you feel about ska as a part of your musical listening experience throughout your life?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I listened to a lot of Real Big Fish in middle school. Maybe some MU330 in high school, Mustard Plug, basically like the biggest names from, I guess that's the third wave of ska. I don't really know much about the genre like before or after that. And I think the only band that I still listen to frequently is just the Bosstones.
Yeah, my only band that I still listen to frequently really from ska, I don't even know if you can consider them ska, but I listen to Link 80 now and then. They were on Asian Man Records, and they used to have their lead singer who passed away some years ago was the romance novelist Danielle Steele's son.
Weird.
So if you know Danielle Steele, her son, Nick Trena, sang in Link 80, who was on Asian Man Records. So I like some Link 80. Loved MU330, man. Chumps on Parade by MU330 is, in my opinion, the best third wave ska record that there is. It is wild. And I think they dubbed themselves for a while Psycho Ska. But I'm super pumped to see MU330 on your list there. I also liked Slapstick, fronted by Brendan Kelly, who went on to sing for the Broadways and the Lawrence Arms. So, but it wasn't really my cup of tea much either. Less Than Jake, Hello Rockview was a record that I got super into for a while, but it was mostly like the fast bands that just had a couple of horn players that captured my attention for ska. So anyway, we have this song Ska Sucks from How to Clean Everything, and we're going to talk about the song in a little bit, but we do have a special guest discussant to chat with you, Keith, about this week's song, Ska Sucks. So tell us a little bit about our guest for this episode.
Yeah, Greg. So Adam Shprintzen is a professor at Marywood University in Pennsylvania, and he and I have been Twitter pals for a while. As a teacher, I follow a lot of hashtag Twitter historians.
Woo!
And Adam's knowledge of U.S. history and food history, punk, religion, all of that, coupled with the fact that he's a pretty funny and kind guy, that made me reach out to him. And I think he had some really thoughtful things to say about a song that is otherwise just kind of easy to write off.
Yeah, and I know that Adam is super into studying the history of vegetarianism as well, which is super relevant to Propagandy.
Mm-hmm.
I think his Twitter handle is even @VegHistory,
Yeah.
Which is really fantastic. So we'll chat about that in a little bit, but let's go to our chat with Dr. Adam Shprintzen.
Adam Shprintzen, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about Propagandy.
Thanks for having me, Keith. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk and to spend some time with you.
So, Adam, can you tell the listeners about your research and your areas of interest as a historian?
Sure. So I broadly, my interests are in kind of 19th century America, food history, history of reform, history of social movements. Like on a more micro level, my real interest is in the history of vegetarianism as a reform movement in the United States. And that kind of pushes me a little bit outside the 19th century into the early years of the 20th century. So I have interest in the idea of social reform, social change, how that takes place, social movements, and then especially how social movements interact with food. Because in the 19th century, vegetarians are kind of one of the first groups that actually pull together, in the United States at least, the idea of social reform being tied together with food choice. So for me, I like to think about history in terms of interpreting people's motives for trying to create a better world, but then also thinking about some of the unintended consequences of that often aren't, that can be unintentionally malicious or even intentionally malicious.
And that includes like the abolition movement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first half of the 19th century, vegetarianism, and the word vegetarian only becomes sort of embraced in the United States around 1848 or so. It previously had some popular use in England. In America, they went through a slew of different sort of terms. I usually just say, meat abstainers, because there wasn't like this coordinated sort of community surrounding that ideology yet until around 1850. But through the first half of the 19th century, people who consciously chose to abstain from meat and linked with others into a community centered their ideology with the other big social reform movements of the time period, especially abolitionism. They saw meat abstention as a way to create a more moral universe. The idea was that only in a society where people were cruel and vicious enough to eat meat, that they would also be cruel and vicious enough to be involved in the chattel slave system. They tied themselves together to the burgeoning women's rights and women's suffrage movement, pacifism. So like the great sort of social reforms of the early 19th century, and vegetarianism was sort of the one conjoining ideology that said all of these important social changes can be achieved through a shift in dietary choice.
Yeah, that kind of resonates, that idea I keep seeing, just, hashtag everything has a history. Who would think that as a vegetarian who's just kind of the awkward person at Thanksgiving in my family, that there's this complex history behind it in the U.S.
I know how that goes. It's funny because that's how I first kind of came across it, because I had stopped eating meat around 2005 or so. I had realized that, this is a not insignificant life change in terms of like not just practice, but like self-identification, right? Like it becomes part of who you are, part of your self-identity. And I was struck sort of by the idea that other significant life identity changes, religion, politics, things like that, most people, and maybe this is a bad assumption, but I think most people would take some time to learn about the history of those ideologies or movements before they said, yeah, I'm part of this, right? And then we make choices of whether we ignore the the bad parts of those histories or not. But it struck me that I had made this pretty significant life change and took on this new identity without actually knowing anything about that history, at least as it related to somebody who lived in the United States. And I had vague sense of sort of the religious connections to vegetarianism over time, and that meat ascension had always happened. But I knew that there had to have been some sort of history of this as a movement in the United States that went before the hippies. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that there was. So it was just kind of like a good confluence of events that happened at the same time that led me down this path. And here I am, like a decade later, still trying to figure it out. And but there's more, right? Everything has a history. There's so much more hidden history about it that it just continues to kind of interest me.
So we're excited to talk to you not only from your perspective as a historian, but also as, you know, a lover of punk music. So can you tell us a little bit also about your relationship with music or with punk? Like what sort of bands grabbed your attention in terms of maybe style or message?
I benefited. I always tell people when I have this conversation about how you start forming a musical identity. And I think people sometimes get that from parents, friends, siblings, and I was lucky that I had an older sister who listened to really good music. So my sister introduced me to music pretty early on, and this is the early and mid 80s in New York. And she was kind of into the new wave movement in the early 80s. So that's kind of like my first foray into music. And you know, there are these threads of sort of confluence between new wave and punk in New York in particular, and globally too. That kind of slowly introduced me into sort of classic old school punk. So I mean, the Ramones are probably the first band that I was ever just really into. And we're talking about like probably when I was like 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
And remain to this day probably one of my you know, absolute favorite bands of all time, because I think they represent something just like just good, just good, enjoyable, and it's what music should be. It just I think music should just be some sort of visceral reaction of just like you listen to something and it's just like it resonates with you, and for whatever reason it just resonated with me. So you know, growing up, I think that certainly the Ramones, the Clash, Bad Brains, moving on to like Minor Threat and Fugazi were sort of bands that I listened to a lot. Circle Jerks, moving towards like Fishbone, things like that. Those were bands that were kind of on my heavy rotation as in my misspent youth. And then I think about that kind of evolving over time and going into college in the mid 90s and starting to get into things like NoFX and the Descendants in particular. I think there is a bit of an evolution there, but it is kind of interesting to think about these things now. And try to think about the question of like how you think about punk, whether it's an aesthetic, is it a musical style, is it something more than that? And I always think about it in terms of how I think about punk as a thing, and in some ways it is an aesthetic. Like we forget about the fact that in the 70s, like there were people on runways dressing in punk fashion, right?
Yeah.
But I think what drew me towards it was the idea of sort of intentionality of politics and music. And all music is political, right? I'd say that the creation of music is a political act. The consumption of music is a political act. But the idea of having sort of intentionally political music was something that appealed to me even as a very young person. I think continues to appeal to me today. And that can go across musical boundaries, from punk to Motown was explicitly political music, hip hop, things like that. And I think maybe that's something that keeps kind of appealing to me as a historian, because it is important. Like it's important in terms of social change. It's important in terms of thinking about how people relate to the world around them. And I think that's where my sort of earliest connection with punk music was thinking about just the intentionality of being political while also creating art.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about this project so far is that I've been able to talk to a number of people who discovered not only, propaganda, but all of punk before I did. So their taste and perspectives are pretty different in terms of a description of the music, or even like what they prefer stylistically, or of course from this band's discography. So what we're talking about today, this episode's a little different because we kind of reach out to people we know and we ask them to send us a few of their favorite propaganda songs. And I assume Ska Sucks is not one of your favorite songs. So why did you pick this one to discuss?
It is not one of my favorite songs,
Yeah.
but interestingly, and probably most importantly, it's the first one that popped into my head. Now, for a few reasons. Probably first and foremost, this is maybe a good lesson in thinking about history and thinking about memory. It's the first propaganda song I remember hearing. So that's right where my mind went, because it brought me back to it when you asked me this question. It brought me right back to that moment in time where I heard this for the first time, and what I thought about it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But like what I thought about that song and what it said and things like that. So it brought me back to this very moment in time, which I discovered this band. While there's something that feels kind of hacky about the song, and it serves like a very specific purpose. I think that the song, in hindsight, and the types of questions that it raises about music, the types of questions that it raises about culture, is actually really interesting and compelling and important, and could lead us to a really good discussion about things related to authenticity, about questions about cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation.
Yeah.
So on its surface, it seems like this silly little satirical song about ska that's also like very like of the moment in time of like early 90s catchy ska tunes. Right. That's the irony of it, is that the song itself is like this catchy, like very prototypical early 90s ska tune. But it actually, to me, raises all these really interesting questions about how we think about and consume culture and consume music. And that may not have been the intention in writing the song. I'm not very familiar with, like, say, the ska scene in Winnipeg in the early 90s or late 80s, but that doesn't, to me, that matters less than what it can mean, because great art is obviously open to interpretation, right? And it can evolve over time. So while it may have been kind of a silly, fluffy little song in 1993, I think thinking about that within an arc of musical history, that it actually reads in a very different way than it maybe did in that moment in time. So the song, it resonated with me because it's the first propaganda song that I ever heard, and that just kind of opened up a new world. And I remember asking somebody. The irony was that I heard it the first time actually at a ska show. This was probably like 94, 95. In the East Village in New York City. And between sets, I'm 95% sure that this was a Mephistopheles show. Phenomenal band name, by the way.
All the ska puns. That's a good one.
That is a good one, right? And the DJ spun it in between sets, and I remember asking somebody who it was, and soon after that, I bought How to Clean Everything soon after that. So as much as it's kind of a fluffy song, it opened up my eyes to this band. So in that sense, I think it's an important song for me as well.
So as a historian, as a fan of punk music, you kind of touched on it. What else do you think this song, like how we can interpret it differently, say in the early 90s versus the context of today? I mean, even singling out like Rudy, just that single word seems to have evolved within, the last in decades. So how could the interpretation, or what the meaning of the song could be over time?
Yeah, I think, looking back at that song in hindsight, especially at a precise moment in time, early 90s, within 3 to 4 years, like third wave ska is going to become a like semi-commercial success in the United States, which is, I don't think anybody could have predicted that necessarily in 1993 or 1994. And I remember when I first listened to the song, trying to like suss out like who was being targeted.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
there's the break in the song where they start playing A Message to You, Rudy. And right, that's a call to the Specials. So is the song making fun of like two-tone ska and the Specials, Selector, bands like that? And it doesn't seem like it is, right? Because there's something kind of, and this is a very charged word, and I might not feel totally okay using it, but maybe it'll spark something, a better conversation about this. But there was something kind of authentic about sort of this, the two-tone ska scene, and the idea that it brought together, I mean, it was a sort of multiracial musical moment of working class people across class boundaries in England. And that's significant, right? Even if it wasn't, right, it was a derivative musical style already that brought in aspects of punk, rhythm and blues, all these other styles that weren't necessarily even natively Jamaican. So trying to think about like who the target of this song was, even if you think about the reference to Message to You, Rudy, like the special song, right? That's a cover of a Dandy Livingstone song, which was the first Jamaican song the first Jamaican artist who charted in the UK. And it was called Rudy, A Message to You. And it was, I mean, very similar, but very distinct. So thinking of questions of authenticity, on one way you could read the song as like a critique of this Jamaican musical style being filtered and changed over time in different places. And the specials changing that song is like is indicative of that. Now, musicians who actually recorded the original Dandy Livingstone song are actually play on that song for the specials. So that maybe complicates things. So to me, it doesn't seem like it's a call out to the specials necessarily, because there's something like inherently like kind of like connected to the past in that song. So when I first heard the song, and this is like the mid 90s, it felt like it was definitely making fun of, or at least calling out, this burgeoning sort of third wave ska scene in the United States. And as somebody who listened to that music, I was in New York at the time, there was a rise in this music sort of as a subculture, but then it kind of took off as a commercial success. It kind of made sense in terms of thinking about these questions of authenticity, right? What does it mean to have a predominantly, to have a Jamaican musical style that was crafted by Black Jamaicans as part of post-colonial identity, no less, produced by predominantly white musicians? And that's what kind of happened in the third wave of ska in the United States. Does that call into question its authenticity? Does it call into question motives? Is it any different than any other musical style, right? That's the history of rock and roll in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think it actually raises these really interesting questions in terms of thinking about, predominantly white American artists, and it wasn't just American artists, but predominantly white American artists taking this Black Jamaican musical form and turning it into something new and different. And then you get all these like derivative ska, ska punk, ska core, like types of styles that started gaining attention around that time. It's funny, I was thinking about this before in terms of like who they're making fun of in the song, and it's like Ska Sucks sounds like it could be like a NoFX song.
Yeah, right.
And so, and it's kind of right. I mean, and I'm sure that wasn't the intention. That's probably not the best way to like make friends with the head of your label. But that's something that I immediately thought of when I heard of that song. Is that it sounds like it could be connected to like a NoFX song or something like that. So to me, it brings up these really interesting questions of what does it mean to try to search for, in music it would mean commercialization. What does it mean as a consumer in terms of what we think about the commercialization of music? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Right? Objectively, if more I say this as somebody who loves first wave ska and rocksteady, and in the same way that I love old school early 70s through the 70s, early 80s punk, right? That if people listen to a third wave ska band or listen to the Green Day, right? It's probably an objectively good thing if it introduces them to everything that came before that. And I guess maybe it's part of me getting older. It feels like any subcultural musical scene that I've ever like floated in really just focuses in on the idea of authenticity and the idea of like what's real, what's fake, what's commercial, what's non-commercial. And I get it, right? I get it because there's an ethos there. But I also question or wonder what that type of gatekeeping does in terms of thinking about, I don't know, like shaming people into not liking something that they like. So it's very, I think it's I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I think but this song makes me think about all those things as not just a consumer, but also as a person who like interacted with all these different groups over time, and thinking about like my own like snobbery that has definitely existed, and whether that's a good thing, destructive thing. But again, like if today in 2020, some 14-year-old kid picks up like a Green Day album, and it means that they end up exploring the Clash, like that's a good thing. And if they enjoy Green Day, like that's also not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's maybe it's part of just getting older, but it makes me think about all these things in terms of how we gatekeep culture, and whether that's a good thing or not.
Yeah, that what is and isn't punk, which seems by itself somewhat like a catch-22 to define something. Being myself kind of more familiar with and immersed in metal, which is so elitist, and what is and isn't like true cult, that has definitely, I agree, it kind of faded over time. That doesn't mean if I'm out buying records somewhere, I don't kind of side-eye the person next to me to see what they're buying, and then I go, oh no. So of course I kind of can't help but do that. But when a student comes up to me and they've discovered some band, and if I think it's not good, I encourage it, because I listened to a lot of really terrible stuff when I was 13 and 14, and my tastes have kind of plateaued. But who knows where I would have ended if people just kind of didn't support it or just shot it down.
And it's fun. Yeah, I think you're getting into something here that like that ties to something that I'm always interested in terms of thinking about history, is just how we romanticize the past. And we romanticize our own past, right? I think about something that I was listening to when I was 12, and there probably was some really terrible music that I was listening to when I was 12. There's probably some terrible music that I'm listening to at 43. And there's nothing wrong with guilty pleasures. Maybe you need to balance that with certain things, but because I catch myself. I do catch myself living in a world in which I interact on a day-to-day basis, or at least previous to being stuck at home, interacted on a day-to-day basis with people generally in the range of like 18 to 22 and 23. And it becomes very easy to shake my fist at like the culture that they consume. And it just means that I'm probably a curmudgeon old man. But on the flip side, like if it's resonant and relevant to them, I don't necessarily know if I need to be the arbiter to do that. But it does take an effort for me to sort of submerge that desire to do so. But it has made me sort of rethink how I thought about music in the past. Everybody's had a moment where they've listened to a song that they're like, oh, this is good. And then they found out who it was, and they're like, oh, I'm not supposed to like this. And it's funny. I remember, and I remember there was a, God, I can't remember. It was on a compilation album. There was an MXPX song on a compilation album called Punk Rock Show that came out, and this is like probably the mid-90s or something. And I remember thinking like, this is a great song, and I had no idea who it was. And I found out who it was, and I just really this feeling of like shame, right? But why? Like it shouldn't be a question of who. It should just be like this aesthetic response to something of if it resonates with you or not, because that's what drew me to punk music in the first place, was like an aesthetic response to something.
My older brother was like, just like listen to Twista every day on the way to high school, and like 3-6 Mafia. And while I like a lot of rap and hip hop, just for me in high school, like a lot of my discovery of punk and metal was kind of trying to be as opposite of my older brother as I could.
And I think like that's what draws people, like that antithesis idea is I think what draws people to punk in general. It just depends on what that target of the antithesis is.
Right.
So for me, it was living in an area where, like my high school, I'd say was like 75% Deadheads. Like
Oh.
this weird, just like Northeast lacrosse, Grateful Dead sort of fusion thing. And I think that my, that my movement towards punk, especially as I was in high school, was definitely in response to that. Which, brings up interesting sort of questions of like what other antitheses you could have gone towards. But
I have this mental image of a bunch of deadheads playing lacrosse now. And all right, let me jump back to all right. So Propaganda has been like pretty openly critical of this song, jokingly making fun of themselves for writing it, but also like seriously reflecting on what the track seems to imply, maybe about race, maybe about culture. So what might you say if a fan pushed back and was just like, this is just a silly song making fun of ska? Like, as a fan of punk music, as a historian, do you hear it as more than that?
I absolutely do hear it as more than that. I think it raises this important question about who gets to represent a music and a culture. And that could be applied to punk, that can be applied to ska, that can reggae, right? Basically every musical art form. Is it okay? Like these are interesting questions that I always think about as a consumer of these things, right? Is it okay for a white ska musician to sing in a patois? Now there's white Jamaicans who have patois, but right, this is a like Black Jamaican cultural marker related to a history and a language. So there's a reason that you should like wince if you hear like a white American musician singing in patois, and yet I don't have that same reaction just listening to say somebody, to a white reggae musician, right? They're playing it well and in an interesting, compelling way. So I struggle in terms of thinking about these ideas of authenticity and this question, I guess, of how do you suss out cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation? And that's a really tricky question. But I think it's also a question that we, especially in this moment in time, we should be thinking about all the more, especially as we think about things in terms of representation in media, TV, movies. It should apply to music as well. So I struggle in terms of trying to figure out what is authentic and what is appreciation and what is appropriation. Now, the historian in me tends to default to thinking of appreciation as somebody, as an artist who's cognizant of and somewhat reverent of the past. It doesn't mean that they have to play a musical style in the exact same way that it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Authenticity and these questions of cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation, and how that relates to how we can approach and thinking about history, and how we can think about as a historian of the United States, how we tend to, how Americans popularly tend to either forget about the past or reinvent the past. So for me, in terms of applying those principles and ideas to music, in terms of figuring out who is authentic or who is appropriating versus who is appreciating, that there has to be some sort of cognizant awareness of the history of that music, the history of the people who produce that music, the politics of that, because there's something very political of the people who are producing this music as it's a pure initial art form. And if you're appreciative of those things, it will not only show in your music, but I think that maybe gives you a little bit of leeway to play with the musical form. Whereas if you're totally ignorant of these things and utilizing the music as a vehicle for commercial success, maybe we're connecting back to the song now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the song says, right, like bands are only in it for the bucks. That if you're just using it for a motive for commercial success without any sort of cognizant awareness of what that meant of what that music meant in the past, that you are kind of leaving yourself open for criticism. So as much as I spoke out against gatekeeping, and I have a bit of a hesitancy for people to gatekeep, I also understand and think it is necessary to maybe make these judgments based on how people think about the history of an art form and a culture, because at that point you're just being exploitative if you are thoroughly unaware of these things.
Yeah, I think for me, thinking back, the song kind of at best, is a novelty song. I can hear the band calling it, youthful folly, maybe the equivalent of a fart joke in a punk album. And at worst, maybe, dismissive and an overly simplified, kind of condescending cheap shot on, a pretty diverse and rich musical subgenre with a really interesting backstory.
And I think it could be, but I think, it's easy to think of something as a novelty song and knock it because of that. And yeah, it is a novelty song. There's like kind of no two ways around that.
Yeah.
But a novelty song can still be insightful, and it still can and maybe this is like the cultural historian side of me. Like a novelty song can say a lot of things about a particular moment in time and a way in which we think about or approach culture. It's funny, like I don't know, this is going to be the strangest musical leap, but when I think about novelty songs, it's the first thing that went into my head. Like the is it Alan Shermer, right? The "Hello Mother, Hello Father" song. Like that's like the peak of novelty music, right? But that song says something so much about like Jewish American culture in the United States in the 50s, and like maybe attached to ideas of Jews becoming white in America, like rise into the middle class and things like that. So to me, a novelty song, yeah, it may be a novelty song, but that doesn't mean that it's not significant or that it's not really insightful. And the very fact that when we first started this conversation on Twitter about talking about a song, that's the first place that my mind went to, it maybe says something about how this song has evolved over time.
Yeah.
And to me, that's one of the great things about music and about art, is that on one hand, you have what the artist is putting out there, and there's an intention there. And that intention often does come through. But the listeners or consumers of that art also, I mean, this is a question about agency. The consumers of that art also have the ability to consume it in a way that that could be different from the original intention, that is just as, if not more, impactful. Now, I don't know if this means that we need more novelty songs or not, but I think it does maybe give us a chance to rethink songs. I mean, this song in particular, but songs in general in the past that we just kind of played off as fluff. Culture is never fluff. It's always more than that. It's always an artifact of the moment in time it was produced, but it's also a lens into everything that happened, since that piece of art was produced. And I think this song is a great example of thinking about how we can look back and reinterpret a song that we played off as being kind of silly novelty fluff in the first place.
Well, Adam, Greg and I were really struggling with how we were going to make an episode about this song. And both of us were somewhat hesitant to take the lead and to really have to come up with an explanation. Like even when I pulled up and copied the lyrics, I realized how few words there are. Obviously, it's a shorter track, but I think this conversation has certainly opened my eyes to some ideas that I hadn't considered about this track, but also just about music in general. So I really thank you for your ideas.
I'm sorry for giving you a song that has like 25 words in it. So I guess we can do a deep dive into analyzing the lyrics. But yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this chat. This was a lot of fun.
So if people want, where can they find you or your work online?
So probably the best way to find me is on the sometimes cesspool of Twitter, which is you can catch me at Veg History. And from there you can find my contact information and information about my book if anybody's interested in reading about vegetarian history.
Yeah, I have a copy of on my growing pile of books on my nightstand. So I'm waiting to dive into that, and hearing you talk about it. Some of those ideas at the beginning of this episode, I think is kind of changing its place in the queue. So, thanks for talking with me today. Thanks for chatting with me on Twitter for the last few years, sharing recipes, insight, and history, and of course about punk music.
This was great. Thanks so much.
All right, Greg. So Adam had a lot to say about a song that doesn't seem to have a lot to say. What stood out to you from our conversation?
So I have a lot of thoughts on this fantastic chat that you had with Adam. I love that he picked a song that is not one of his favorites. That really cracks me up. I think that it's so fitting that a PhD historian who studies vegetarianism loves propaganda. I have no doubt that there are, I don't know, many professionals around the world out there who were exposed to propaganda, and then that had some kind of impact on their career path. You know what I mean? Like, imagine not discovering propaganda, but like if he like hadn't discovered that, like, would he necessarily have become a historian of vegetarianism? I mean, it's really quite profound whenever you consider how bands can actually change people's lives. And I don't know if Adam did that specifically, but you know, it's not too far-fetched. So anyway, so Adam's identity formation story about his older sister was just so perfect. You had me in stitches over here. I was rolling on the floor. I want to go to shows with Adam. Also, his list of bands was so fantastic. He listed like all of my favorite bands ever. So that was amazing. Something else that Adam says, I like that he said that that consumption of music is political, and that intentionally political music appeals to him, because I agree. It reminds me of people freaking out now on the internet saying like, I liked your music until you got all political. Keep your politics out of your music. Just shut up and sing. And, you know, like, it reminds me of how people, you know, that former congressman and Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, one time said that his favorite band was Rage Against the Machine. Like, what? You know? And so, you know, I feel like I want to put like people like Adam and Chris Deutsch, who we've had on the show before. I want to put people like those guys like in a room, and people who love like some other bands in another room, and then make them all take the GRE or something like that and see like which room of people does better on like the graduate record examination. I feel like that would be super funny, because I'm consistently impressed with the level of intellect out there from some of Propaganda's fans. So another thing that jumped out at me was Adam's stories of growing up going to shows, and a band name that jumped out at me a lot is the band Mephistopheles, which is a portmanteau between ska and Mephistopheles from Faust. So that's pretty cool. Mephistopheles jumped out at me because Michael McDermott, who used to play for the Bouncing Souls and is one of my all-time favorite drummers. So he leaves the Bouncing Souls and he played for a while in Mephistopheles, and I went to see them live just so I could see Michael McDermott play drums again. And funny story, Michael McDermott now plays drums for Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. And I would go see Joan Jett and the Blackhearts live anyway.
Yeah.
But knowing I'd get to see Michael McDermott play drums again would just be like the cherry on top. So big ups to Mephistopheles and Adam for name dropping that band. So another thing that jumps out at me is the fact that Adam found Propaganda because of Ska Sucks, you know? And so he's at this show, he hears it in between bands, and it's so cool that Adam like actually had the wherewithal to ask and get the answer to who played the song that was on the PA system in between bands, because he just as easily could have not asked, because it wasn't like Anti-Manifesto was blaring. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It wasn't like it was like an amazing early Propaganda song. It was the worst early Propaganda song. I mean, they have, I'm not talking about the 7-inches and stuff, you know? So, and like, this reminds me of like today where, if I go to a show and I hear something on the speaker between bands, all I got to do is bust out my SoundHound app on my phone to find out what's playing. And, you know, it reminds me of this moment where like you can make a new friend by being like, hey, do you know who this is on the PA system? But now you don't have to make that friend. You just bust out your app on your phone and it recognizes the song for you. Like, I remember a few years ago, I was at an Every Time I Die show, and Sabaton was playing in between bands.
A Sabaton.
And it was the album Carolus Rex. So
Oh,
it
man.
was the title track, like Carolus Rex. You know, they're like this like Viking, like marching sounding to war band. There was this guy on the stage setting up gear, and he was singing Carolus Rex, man. And so I busted out Soundhound. And, you know, that's just one example of finding a new band in between bands, like over the PA system. Another thing that I learned today from you guys is that this is that Rudy, A Message to You, that is name dropped in this Propaganda song,
Mm-hmm.
is not a Specials song.
Right. Yeah.
I was today years old when I found out that this was not, but that song was not by the Specials. When did you learn that?
I think the day before, or when he had messaged me, and I kind of I listened to the song that he told me about, and if Rudy in the Specials song, if that refers to, or this version refers to like fans of ska, the original is referring to like rude boys, meaning essentially the criminal element in Jamaica. So like that term itself evolving over time. But yeah, I had never heard it, and I think it's really good. It's like it almost has like this sweet, genuine feel to it, and it's a pretty good song.
Yeah. I found that the song was also extremely endearing. I went back and listened to
Yeah.
the original one, and I could imagine that song being written by like a middle school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Who sees his students go off and do things after school that he's working so hard to try to dissuade them from doing. And he reaches the end of his rope, and he, sings this song, Stop You Messing Around.
Right.
And it sent me down like a little rabbit hole of searching for like 1960s and 70s ska. And wow, there is so much I don't know. You know what I mean?
I don't know any of it. Yeah.
I was listening to a bunch of 1970s Toots and the Maytals for a long time after I listened to Livingstone's Rudy that you and Adam talked about. So that's another thing that jumps out, and the vast history of this genre that is so important to know if you're going to talk about it, in any kind of critical cultural way. Another thing that jumped out at me is the derivatives section about like ska punk and ska core and the different waves of ska. That was super interesting to me. And I name dropped Slapstick earlier, whose singer was Brendan Kelly, who sings in the Lawrence Arms, but also Dan Andriano from the Alkaline Trio was in that band as well. And they were like a 90s ska punk band. And so many sounds, have come off of this ska genre. The question that Adam posed about who gets to represent music and culture was super fascinating to me. The point about patois was super interesting. Who can sing, who should sing in this patois accent? What is the difference between cultural appropriation versus appreciation, and how like culture is never fluff. So
yeah,
these were some of the main points that jumped out at me. What are some of your favorite things about what Adam had to say?
Yeah, I think just that the fact that it's a conversation, and that maybe that what the song means isn't as important as what the song could mean. And that description, in leading us to other conversations, if they're cultural, historical, if they're about race, if they're about appropriation, if they're about authenticity, that piece there I thought was enlightening in a way, because I wasn't really expecting it for such a dumb song.
Yeah, so I have to just go ahead and say to the audience right now that I do not like this Propaganda song. Like,
I don't think anyone is surprised.
Yeah, I do not like it. When some of my favorite songs are like Duplicate Keys of Caro, Dear Coach's Corner, Without Love, Back to the Motor League, Purina Hall of Fame. I have like a style of Propaganda that I'm like super into. I don't appreciate this joke song. So knowing my personal hatred of this song was going to come out on this episode, I decided to stop myself before I spiraled and launch into something interesting that would possibly expand my musical palette. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity not to harp on this particular song, but to see what ska had to offer me that I didn't know about.
Cool.
So instead of like being like, oh, I can't believe this stupid song, blah, 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 I wanted to see what kind of ska was out there that I have neglected to explore. There's only so much music that a person can explore in their lifetime. I can only listen to so many records. I can only find so many bands. So something positive that I did is I watched a documentary today called This Is Ska, which traced the history of ska back to 1959 in Kingston. Some new music that I listened to today was by Byron Lee, Jimmy Cliff. I really enjoyed the Jimmy Cliff song, The Harder They Come. I listened to a whole bunch of Toots and the Maytals. I listened to Desmond Decker. The song Israelites by Desmond Decker is gorgeous. The vocal melody is unbelievable. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the term ska as well. So I did a little digging. And I learned that the ska started out as a multi-part dance move. And like back in the day, like whenever you'd see people doing the Macarena and there was like a series of steps they would go through.
Yeah, the Cupid Shuffle or some orchestrated dance.
Yeah, all those that you see in like, that you would see them at like skating rinks or you would see them at like dance clubs or whatever. So anyway, the ska started out as something just like that, apparently, with like a multi-part dance move. So that was super interesting. So I watched a video of a Byron Lee song where people were doing the ska, which is the dance, to the music. And I found another documentary as well called The Origin of the Word Ska with Benjamin Zephaniah, which had several interesting takeaways that I found out. So a journalist named Maureen Cleave got the word ska in print for the first time in the UK in 1964 after writing about Chris Blackwell, who founded Island Records. And there are a few different theories presented in the film about what the word ska means. So the first one is that that the word ska is based on the sound the guitar made with the upstroke. So ska, 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 ska. It's got that ska, 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 ska. So it's got this sound with this upstroke.
Like an onomatopoeia.
Yeah. And so another theory is that it comes from the word scat, like scat singing, like Louis Armstrong, or from like the Monkey in the Jungle Book, like shooter shoobop, shoobop, And so ska also had like a heyday in the like the 1960s in the aftermath of Jamaica's independence from Britain. And it soundtracked that period, man.
Yeah.
Like that social like change that happened after Jamaica's independence. Like ska was the soundtrack of that. So like, anyway, the history of this musical movement is so rich, so layered, and has so many historical contexts that must be considered. So needless to say, I like these songs that I've been listening to today from like the 60s in Jamaica way more than Real Big Fish.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to dive in and check them out. Make a playlist for me.
Yeah, maybe I'll put some notes or some links in the show notes for listeners where they, if they want to go and learn a little bit more about ska, they totally can. So let's go ahead and dive into the lyrics for Propagandy's Ska Sucks. First of all, this is one of how many songs on this record? 3 that are like novelty tracks.
Yeah.
So the lyrics for Ska Sucks are not even included in the liner notes for the LP and the CD. Why do you think that is?
I didn't realize that. I don't know. I mean, I know Chris Hanna mentioned that Fat Mike was really pushing for those novelty tracks to be on them, that he really liked this and Haley Selassie and the Cheap Trick cover. So if it was like a last minute decision and those were kind of forced onto the album, if they didn't want to include them because they're so dumb and juvenile, a combination of the two.
Yeah, well, and I'm looking at the lyric sheet right now inside the LP, and so there's also the song This Might Be Satire on side B, and it says, I want to chew my bub. Ah, what a waste of space. Next. So like on the inside of the LP, instead of I want to chew my bubble gum with you, I wanna walk you home from school. They don't even put that in the lyric sheet because and here it says what a waste of space. So I'm wondering if the fact that Chris didn't want these songs on the record to begin with and that he would have rather had Pigs Will Pay, which wound up on the 7-inch. I'm wondering if they didn't put that in there because they were disappointed that it made the record in the first place.
Yeah, I get a little bit of a feeling regardless that they're also not taking the record too seriously.
Yeah. I love his stories of recording during that time period. And I mean, it is hilarious to me how good this band is now. And when you listen to them tell stories of themselves when they were like in their early 20s first signing to Fat, how they knew nothing. And Chris's stories of like bringing his like amp head in a hockey bag to the LAX airport and seeing Wayne Gretzky walk by at baggage claim. It's too much because he's like, I knew nothing. We knew nothing. And you're like, come on, you must have known something. But the way that they present it is like they were completely clueless about everything. It's just too funny. So let's talk about something that I can like about the lyrics. So I get the critique of the line, the bands are only in it for the bucks, right? And so to me, it makes sense if I think about a band like No Doubt with Gwen Stefani, right? Who started off as a ska band, but then like immediately bailed on that sound when it was more profitable for them to bail on being a ska band.
Yeah.
So I get that part fully. Okay. That's like the one thing that I'm taking away from these lyrics. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's like a sense of like a punk attitude, not necessarily resentment, since they clearly have stated that commercial viability has never been a goal of theirs, but instead, like they just would rather be punks and point the finger at other bands jumping in on a trend. That's what I definitely, that's how I kind of interpret, I think, the purpose of the song as well. And Chris also mentioned in the Haley Selassie podcast that there was a push and a rise in white nationalist and white power ska and punk bands at this time, and that part of the way to undercut that and a part of the way to undercut those bands' popularity was kind of to mock the reality that these white nationalists are borrowing music and stealing music from a culture they consider to be inferior.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So what do you think about the music for this song?
Yeah. So I don't know. I think the remastered version, it makes it a little bit more palatable to the ear. The tones are a little better. There's some more clarity. But it can only help so much, right? You can't really polish a turd. I like the music during the break, like the Rudy part. But ultimately it doesn't take itself seriously, and that seems to be intentional. What the outcome is and what conversations take place because of that, I can't say, but there's like that goofy laugh right after the "Fuck You, Rudy."
Oh my God, it's like Krusty the Clown. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really. There's a fart sound at the end. There's like the do 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 do. So I mean, it seems to be sending a message like, don't take this too seriously, and maybe they just needed a filler, and people like novelty songs. So
Yeah.
if it is Fat Mike pushing for it and getting this on the album, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, there's not much to say musically.
Yeah. I mean, what's so interesting, though, is the presence of these novelty songs. And I wonder if novelty songs on punk records have always been there, or if this is something I'm just now realizing. I know that there's like always the Offspring songs like Pretty Fly for a White Guy and all that stuff. You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
know that NoFX has tons of novelty songs. But like outside of those two bands, like there's not like a novelty Pennywise song that I can think of. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the only one that came to mind as well, and I messaged with Adam a little bit after our conversation and saying that, even novelty songs have something to say. Well, on the only good fascist is a dead fascist.
Yeah.
Also, to me, very much feels like a novelty track because it sounds so different from the rest of the band's discography and certainly everything else from Less Talk. But that song has like super powerful things to say, even if it's not necessarily serious in its sound.
I legitimately like that song.
Oh, same. I love that track.
Yeah. So while I was spiraling in my hatred for Ska Sucks, I went on YouTube and I looked up to see if anybody had done any covers of this song that I could listen to that might help me reframe what I was listening to, right? So I found that Big D and the Kids Table covered this in 2016, it's a really cool cover because in the middle of the song, they go into the original Livingstone Message to You, Rudy.
Oh,
And
cool.
and it's so slow. Like it's just so slow. Stop you messing around. Like real slow, right? But then they go back into the Propagandy song and they end the song with totally different lyrics than Propagandy did. And part of the lyrics are about ripping on people who only know Propagandy's old songs. So like people who say like, oh, How to Clean Everything. And like, that's like the only Propagandy record they know. Like Big D and the Kids Table covered a song from How to Clean Everything and ripped on people that only know How to Clean Everything. So that was hilarious. Loved that little touch. The band Against All Authority, who was like sort of like a hardcore band, like ska punk elements. They were on Hopeless Records. They did a cover of this song in 2001. And, Against All Authority is like super gritty, but they're also super ideologically aligned with Propagandy. They sing a lot about police brutality, and they're just a fantastic band. So I was really excited to see an Against All Authority cover of this song as well. So do you have any lessons that you would take away from this song before we go away today?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to double down with that phrase that I said with Adam. Everything has a history, and exploring what that history is good. And it's a good way to learn about yourself and the world, and maybe just kind of shutting something out or demeaning it probably won't take you too far. So everything has a history, even ska.
Yeah, learning the history of moments like these in time, and also when Adam said culture is never fluff. I mean, I could not agree more. And so instead of like, latching onto what I didn't like about this particular song from Propagandy, like I found so much other great music today that I was listening to. And I don't know, man, I think I'm going to have to just stock up on Jimmy Cliff records and I know that Tim Armstrong from Rancid is a massive Jimmy Cliff fan. So I think that I need to go off and find some things that I can appreciate, because 60s ska is absolutely perfect to have on in the kitchen while you're cooking dinner. I mean, could not stress that enough. I had Toots and the Maytals and Jimmy Cliff on while I was cooking dinner, and it was spectacular.
I can only listen to so much black metal and grind, so feel free to make me a playlist.
Hey, maybe I will. So did you find any YouTube comments out there or anything?
Yeah, so one says, I get how this song is easy to misunderstand if you don't know the historical context, but this song is totally sarcastic. You have to remember this is considered a ska punk classic from within the community, precisely because they capture the sound while also criticizing bands like No Doubt and Sublime, two bands I love from the 90s who play ska-esque music, but later denied being ska bands when it stopped being cool.
Oh, sweet. That's just exactly what I said earlier.
Yeah.
No, that's okay, interesting. Okay, that's cool. What else?
And another said, and another said, the song is ahead of its time.
I don't know if I agree. I'm not sure.
I'm going to bet money that person's just being snarky.
They probably are. Okay. So anyway, thanks for the comments out there on YouTube. Go ahead and rate this bad boy.
I'm going to say it's a 1. Maybe I sang along with this when I first bought this record in like late 2003 or so. But it's ultimately a skippable track. And I enjoyed the conversation with Adam Shprintzen more than I do the song itself.
Absolutely. I would actually encourage skipping this track. Not only is it a skippable track, but I would actively do my best to persuade people to just skip it and go find some Jimmy Cliff instead. So I would rate this a 1 out of 5 as well. Am I allowed to give it a 0.5 out of 5? If I were able to do that, I would do it. I would give it less than a 1 if I could. But man, that chat with Adam was fantastic. And I have gone down such a magnificent 1960s Jamaican ska rabbit hole that, I'll stick with my 1 because I'm grateful for the tangent that I went on today to expand my own musical horizons.
Nice.
So that's it for this week. Thanks again to Dr. Adam Shprintzen for hanging out with us. You should follow him on Twitter at VegHistory, VEG History. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at PropagandyPod. Keith and I really love hearing from you. If we ruin your favorite song, hit us up and we will personally apologize. Thank you so much for listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about Propagandy. See you next time. Unscripted Moments, a podcast about Propagandy, is created, hosted, and produced by Keith Goff and Greg Soden. Musical clips on this show are composed and performed by Propagandy. Artwork on the show is by Justin Santora, who can be reached at justinsantora.com. You can find us on Twitter at PropagandyPod and on Instagram at PropagandyPod. If you like the show, please drop a rating on your podcast app of choice and subscribe to receive future episodes. Tell your friends. Thank you so much for listening.